The massive crystal halls of Nexus Prime sparkled like diamonds as beings from across the galaxy gathered for their biggest celebration in 300 years. Ships from 1,000 different worlds had arrived, their crews eager to mark this incredible milestone. The air itself seemed to shimmer with joy and relief as delegates took their seats in the enormous chamber. Ambassador Veltar stepped up to the speaking platform, his reptilian skin catching the light from the artificial stars above. His species, the hegemony, had been one of the most powerful forces in the galaxy for generations. Today he wore ceremonial robes that marked him as a keeper of galactic peace. "My friends," his voice boomed across the hall, "today we celebrate something our great-grandparents could never have imagined. 300 years without a single major war. 3 centuries of peace that has allowed us to build, to grow, to become more than we ever dreamed possible." The crowd erupted in cheers. Beings with tentacles waved them in the air. Creatures with multiple heads nodded in unison. Even the usually stoic rock people from the mineral world seemed pleased, their stone faces cracking into what might have been smiles. Veltar raised his clawed hand for silence. This peace came at a price, but it was a price worth paying. The Terran Containment Protocol has kept the most dangerous species in the galaxy safely locked away on their home worlds. Humans remain where they belong, far from our civilized conflicts. Behind him, a massive wall displayed the names of civilizations that had fallen in the old days. Thousands upon thousands of species that had been wiped out during the age of constant warfare. The memorials served as a reminder of why peace was so precious. In the back rows of the Great Hall, younger delegates whispered to each other. Most of them had been born long after the last Great War. They knew humans existed somewhere out in the galaxy, but they were like scary stories parents told children. Dangerous beings locked away for everyone's safety. Why are humans so dangerous? Gasped a young delegate from the water worlds, her gills fluttering with curiosity. Her companion, a bird-like creature from the sky cities, ruffled his feathers nervously. The old treaties just say they were too unstable for civilized warfare, something about their methods being wrong for proper war. But what does that mean? The water dweller pressed. The bird being shrugged his wings. No one talks about it. It's ancient history now. As Veltar continued his speech, praising the wisdom of their ancestors and the beauty of their peaceful age, the younger delegates found themselves wondering about these mysterious humans. What could make an entire species so dangerous that the whole galaxy agreed to lock them away? Suddenly, piercing alarms shattered the peaceful atmosphere. Red lights flashed throughout the crystal halls as emergency broadcasts interrupted the celebration. The massive screens that had been showing peaceful images of member worlds now displayed something horrifying. "Emergency alert from the Outer Rim territories," a mechanical voice announced. "The Zephyrian Empire has launched a full-scale military campaign. Multiple star systems under attack. Repeat, the Zephyrians are at war." The celebration died instantly. Delegates who had been laughing and cheering moments before now stared in shock at the images flooding their screens. Massive insect-like ships, each one the size of a city, swarmed through space like angry wasps. Planets burned, space stations exploded. Entire fleets vanished under waves of enemy fire. Counselor Prime Zalthis, the highest-ranking official in the galaxy, stood frozen at his seat. His blue skin had turned pale as he watched the casualty reports climbing higher and higher. The Zephyrians were unlike any enemy the modern galaxy had faced. They weren't interested in negotiation or limited warfare. Their insect minds worked as one giant hive, making decisions instantly and carrying them out without hesitation. They threw their ships and soldiers at enemies like waves crashing against a shore, caring nothing for losses. "How many systems have fallen?" someone called out. 3 systems in 2 days," came the terrified reply. "They're moving faster than our scouts can track them." The galaxy's peacekeeping forces had been built for a different kind of war. They were trained to make surgical strikes with minimal casualties. They followed rules of engagement that protected civilians and preserved infrastructure. They were civilized soldiers for a civilized age, but the Zephyrians didn't care about rules. They didn't worry about civilian casualties or preserving anything. They consumed everything in their path like a swarm of locusts, turning entire worlds into resources for their endless expansion. "Send the 5th Fleet to intercept them," Zalthis ordered, his voice shaking slightly. A communications officer looked up from his console, his face white with fear. "Sir, the Fifth Fleet was already deployed. They're gone. Complete destruction. No survivors." The Great Hall fell silent, except for the continued blaring of alarms. For 300 years, the galaxy had known only peace. Their armies had become parade units. Their weapons were designed for show more than warfare. Their tactics were built around the idea that all conflicts could be resolved through proper channels and civilized discussion. Now they faced an enemy that had never stopped preparing for war, an enemy that saw death not as something to be avoided, but as just another tool to be used. The Zephyrians had been building their strength in the dark spaces between galaxies, waiting for the right moment to strike. As the session dissolved into chaos, with delegates shouting orders and demanding answers that no one had, a single thought echoed through every mind in that crystal hall. Their 3 centuries of peace had made them soft. They had forgotten how to fight real wars, and somewhere in the back of their collective memory, locked away behind centuries of intentional forgetting, was the knowledge that there was one species that had never forgotten how to wage war. One species that had been too dangerous for their civilized conflicts. The humans were still out there, waiting in their exile. But would they help the galaxy that had abandoned them? And perhaps more importantly, could the galaxy survive asking for their help? The news kept getting worse every day. 6 entire star systems had been wiped out in just 2 weeks, and the Zephyrian war machine showed no signs of slowing down. Their insect ships moved like a plague of locusts across the galaxy, devouring everything they touched. Planets that had thrived for centuries were now nothing but empty husks, stripped of all life and resources. In the deepest vaults of the Council Library, Ambassador Kethra sat surrounded by stacks of ancient files. Her species had 4 arms, which usually made research much easier, but today all 4 hands shook as she turned page after page of classified documents. These weren't just any old records. These were the forbidden files, sealed away for 300 years and marked with warnings that made even experienced diplomats nervous. The restricted archive section felt like a tomb. Dust motes floated in the dim light, and the air recyclers hummed quietly in the background. Kethra had needed special permission just to enter this place, and even more authorization to access the files she was reading now. Every page required her fingerprint, retinal scan and voice confirmation. The Council really hadn't wanted anyone looking at this stuff, but desperate times called for desperate measures, and times had never been more desperate than they were. Right now, most of the documents about humanity's last war were covered in thick black bars, where information had been deliberately hidden. Page after page showed nothing but crossed out lines and missing paragraphs, but here and there fragments remained, little pieces of text that had somehow escaped the censor's attention. Psychological devastation beyond acceptable parameters. Read one report from a general whose name had been erased from history. Another fragment caught her eye. Complete enemy capitulation achieved through non-kinetic means. She had to read that twice to make sure she understood it correctly. Non-kinetic meant they had won without actually firing weapons. How was that even possible? The most chilling fragment came from what looked like a committee report. Recommend immediate species-wide containment. Risk to galactic stability cannot be overstated. Kethra leaned back in her chair, trying to process what she was reading. These weren't the records of a violent, uncontrolled species that needed to be locked away for everyone's safety. These were the records of something much more frightening, a species that was so good at warfare that they had terrified their own allies. The soft chime of the archive door made her jump. She quickly closed the files as Councillor Prime Zalthis entered the room. The highest-ranking official in the galaxy looked like he had aged 10 years in the past 2 weeks. His usually perfect appearance was disheveled, his ceremonial robes wrinkled from too many sleepless nights in emergency meetings. "How bad is it?" Kethra asked, though she could read the answer in his exhausted expression. "The core worlds are next," he said simply, collapsing into a chair across from her. "Our military strategists estimate we have maybe a month before the Zephyrians reach the inner systems, maybe less if they keep accelerating their advance." Kethra felt her heart sink. The core worlds weren't just important planets, they were the center of galactic civilization. Billions of beings lived there, including the families of most council members. If those worlds fell, the galaxy as they knew it would cease to exist. Our doctrine of minimal casualties, Zalthis continued, his voice hollow, means absolutely nothing against an enemy that views death as just another form of reproduction. Every soldier they lose just feeds their war machine. Every ship we destroy just gives them more raw materials to build 10 more. The Zephyrians didn't think like other species. Most civilizations valued individual lives, tried to preserve their people, avoided unnecessary risks. But the Zephyrians were insects at heart, driven by hive instincts that made individual survival meaningless. They would sacrifice 1 million soldiers without hesitation if it helped them win a single battle. Kethra gestured at the ancient files spread across her desk. Perhaps we were too hasty in our judgment 3 centuries ago. Zalthis stared at the documents for a long moment. You're suggesting we contact Earth? His voice carried an odd mixture of horror and hope, like someone considering jumping off a cliff to escape a fire. The fragments I've found, she said carefully, they don't describe a species that was banned for being too violent. They describe a species that was banned for being too effective. The silence stretched between them. Both of them understood what they were really discussing. For 300 years, the galaxy had told itself that humans were locked away because they were dangerous primitives who couldn't be trusted with civilized warfare. But the truth seemed to be something much more complex and frightening. The vote will be close, Kethra admitted. Many council members believe that unleashing humans again could doom us all. They think we'd just be trading one threat for another, and what do you think? Zalthis asked. Kethra looked down at the classified files, at the fragments of truth that had survived 3 centuries of deliberate forgetting. I think we're going to find out what we're really made of. The Emergency Council. Session that followed was unlike anything in galactic history. For 18 straight hours, delegates argued, shouted, pleaded, and threatened. Some wanted to fight the Zephyrians with conventional forces, despite all evidence that such tactics were useless. Others suggested negotiation, even though the insects had never responded to diplomatic overtures. But as the hours wore on and more reports came in of advancing Zephyrian fleets, the horrible mathematics of the situation became clear. They were going to lose. Their peaceful galaxy, built on 3 centuries of avoiding the very kind of warfare they now faced, was simply not equipped to handle an enemy like this. When the final vote was called, it came down to a single ballot. By the narrowest possible margin, the Council authorized contact with Earth. A secret diplomatic mission would be dispatched immediately to the Sol system, carrying with it the first official communication between humanity and the galaxy in 300 years. As the meeting broke up, delegates filed out in worried silence. They had just made a decision that could save them all or destroy everything they had built. Because while they knew almost nothing about what humans had become during their long exile, they remembered enough to be afraid. The ship that left for Earth that day carried more than just diplomats. It carried the hopes and fears of an entire galaxy, and the desperate prayer that the species they had locked away in fear might still be willing to save them all. The Council's diplomatic ship approached the Sol system with sensors running at maximum range, expecting to find a primitive civilization barely scraping by after 3 centuries of isolation. What they discovered instead made their instruments go haywire with confusion. Earth's orbital defenses had detected their approach long before they reached the outer planets. Ships unlike anything in the galactic database moved to intercept them. Sleek vessels that seemed to bend light around themselves, making them nearly invisible against the backdrop of space. The technology was completely foreign, evolved along paths that galactic science had never even considered. By the time the EI delegation reached Earth's moon, they found themselves surrounded by a defensive grid that put the core world's security to shame. Massive space stations hung in perfect formation, their purposes mysterious but clearly military. Energy readings suggested weapons systems that operated on principles the galaxy's best scientists couldn't identify. General Kim Min-ho waited in Earth's military headquarters as the alien delegation was escorted through corridors lined with displays of human achievement. The visitors' eyes widened as they passed laboratories working on technologies that seemed impossible, manufacturing facilities that operated without any workers, and strategic planning rooms where holographic battlefields showed scenarios they had never imagined. The general himself was not what they expected. Calm, composed, wearing a simple uniform without the elaborate decorations common among galactic military leaders. When he spoke, his voice carried the quiet confidence of someone who had never doubted his own capabilities. "So," he said as the delegation was seated in the conference room, "after 300 years of silence, the galaxy remembers we exist." Ambassador Veltar, who had led the mission to Earth, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The journey had already shaken his assumptions about human civilization. Now facing this unflappable military leader, he felt even more out of his depth. "General Kim, we come seeking your assistance," Veltar began, launching into the prepared speech about the Zephyrian threat and the galaxy's desperate situation. As he spoke, describing the insect swarms and their devastating advance, General Kim's expression never changed. If anything, he seemed almost amused by the tale of galactic military forces crumbling before an enemy that fought without regard for civilized warfare. "Interesting," the general said when the ambassador finished. 3 centuries of treating us like dangerous animals, and now you want our help because you've encountered something actually dangerous." Admiral Park Soo-jin, who had been silent until now, leaned forward in her chair. Her dark eyes studied the alien delegates with the intensity of a predator evaluating prey. "Tell me, Ambassador, what exactly did your intelligence files say about why we were exiled?" Veltar hesitated. The truth was, most of the records had been classified beyond his clearance level. The treaties mentioned that human methods were incompatible with civilized warfare. Park exchanged a glance with General Kim, and both humans smiled in a way that made the aliens deeply uncomfortable. "Would you like to know what really happened?" Kim asked, standing up and gesturing toward the door. "I think it's time you understood exactly what you're asking for." The group moved through the headquarters to what appeared to be a museum wing, the War Memorial Museum, according to the sign, chronicling humanity's military history. But this wasn't a dusty collection of old artifacts. It was a living, breathing archive of human strategic thinking. Holographic displays materialized around them, showing battles and campaigns from humanity's past involvement in galactic affairs. The delegates watched in growing horror as the true scope of human military capability revealed itself. The Krillian Empire, General Kim narrated, as images showed a proud warrior culture that had dominated its region of space for millennia. They prided themselves on their fighting spirit and their code of honor in battle. The hologram showed human forces engaging the Krillians, but not in the way anyone expected. Instead of meeting them in honorable combat, humans had launched what could only be described as psychological warfare, on a scale the galaxy had never seen. "We studied their culture, their beliefs, their deepest fears," Admiral Park explained. "Then we turned those against them. Within 6 months, their warrior society was tearing itself apart from within. They surrendered not because we defeated their armies, but because we convinced them their own honor code was meaningless." The high next display showed the Malthusian Rebellion, an uprising that had threatened to tear apart an entire sector of the galaxy. The rebels had entrenched themselves on heavily fortified worlds, prepared for a siege that could last decades. "Complete orbital sterilization," Kim said simply. "Not of the planets themselves, but of their ability to sustain the rebellion. We didn't destroy their cities. We made it impossible for them to feed their populations, to maintain their equipment, to continue their cause. They had to surrender or watch their people starve." But it was the final display that truly shocked the delegation. The Titan hegemony had been one of the most powerful military forces of its era, with fleets that numbered in the thousands and weapons that could crack planets. "We never fired a shot at their main fleet," Admiral Park said with evident pride. "Instead, we systematically dismantled their entire support infrastructure: supply lines, communication networks, manufacturing facilities, training academies, everything that made their military possible. Their ships became floating museums, powerful but completely useless without the civilization that supported them." The Holograms faded, leaving the delegation standing in stunned silence. These weren't the tactics of a violent, uncontrolled species. These were the methods of a civilization that understood warfare as both art and science, that saw every conflict as a puzzle to be solved rather than a test of strength. "You didn't ban us because we were too violent," General Kim said, his voice carrying the weight of 3 centuries of exile. "You banned us because we were too effective, because we fought wars you couldn't understand and won victories that made you uncomfortable." The truth hung in the air between them. The galaxy hadn't feared human brutality. They had feared human competence. After hours of internal debate among the human leadership, Admiral Park returned with their answer. "We'll help you," she said, "but only with complete operational autonomy. No interference, no oversight, no questions about our methods. And," General Kim added, "we want a formal apology for 3 centuries of exile, an acknowledgement that we were wrongfully imprisoned not for our crimes, but for your fears." The delegation agreed immediately. They had no choice. As their ship prepared to return to the galaxy with news of humanity's decision, they couldn't shake the feeling that they had just unleashed something far more complex and dangerous than the Zephyrian swarm. But perhaps, in a galaxy facing extinction, that was exactly what they needed. The moment Earth Command gave the authorization, something extraordinary began to unfold across the Sol system. Hidden bases that had been invisible for centuries suddenly came alive with activity. Ships that had been waiting in the shadows of asteroids and behind the dark sides of moons started moving with perfect coordination. These weren't the massive battleships or heavy cruisers that dominated galactic warfare. Human vessels were sleek, angular things that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Their hulls were made from materials that bent electromagnetic radiation around them, making them nearly impossible to detect. Even when Zephyrian sensors swept directly over them, the readings came back as empty space. But the most shocking thing wasn't their invisibility. It was where they went. Instead of racing toward the front lines where Zephyrian fleets were advancing, on the core worlds, human ships took positions that made no tactical sense to anyone watching. They stationed themselves near communication relays, around data processing centers, close to civilian installations that had no apparent military value. Commander Lee Hyun-woo coordinated the first phase of the operation from his stealth frigate, positioned just outside a major Zephyrian communication hub. His ship was so close to enemy forces that he could see the insect warriors moving around their installations, yet his vessel remained completely undetected. "All units, begin phase." "1," he ordered into his headset. What happened next was unlike anything the galaxy had ever witnessed. While Zephyrian military forces prepared their weapons and positioned their fleets for massive battles that would never come, human operatives began the most sophisticated infiltration operation in recorded history. The Zephyrians communicated through a hive mind network that connected every member of their species. It was their greatest strength: perfect coordination, instant decision-making, no confusion or miscommunication. But it was also their greatest weakness, and humans had spent 3 centuries studying exactly how to exploit it. Across Zephyrian space, their communication networks suddenly began carrying something new. Not military orders or tactical information, but ideas that had never existed in their collective consciousness before. The concept of individual identity started spreading through their mental links like a computer virus, followed by the notion of personal ambition, the fear of meaningless death, and the radical idea that maybe, just maybe, the collective wasn't always right. For a species that had existed for millions of years as a unified mind, these thoughts were devastating. Individual Zephyrians began to experience something they had no words for: the feeling of being alone inside their own heads, cut off from the comforting presence of the hive. Lieutenant Colonel Choi Soo-jin led the second phase from her position near a Zephyrian colony world. Her team wasn't there to bomb military installations or engage enemy fleets. Instead, they had been studying Zephyrian behavior patterns, social structures, and psychological weaknesses for months. The propaganda they introduced was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. Using their deep understanding of insect behavior and hive mentality, Human specialists crafted messages designed to create doubt, confusion, and internal conflict. They didn't attack Zephyrian beliefs directly. That would have been too obvious. Instead, they asked questions. What if the Hive was wrong about expansion being necessary? What if individual Zephyrians had value beyond their service to the collective? What if there were other ways to exist besides constant conquest and consumption? These questions spread through Zephyrian communication networks faster than their commanders could stop them. Soon, reports began reaching the Galactic Council of something that should have been impossible: Zephyrian forces hesitating in the middle of battle, questioning direct orders, experiencing what could only be described as doubt. Captain Yunji Hai monitored the strategic situation from her command ship, analyzing 3 centuries of Zephyrian expansion data that human intelligence had quietly collected during their exile. Her findings were both comprehensive and damning. Their supply lines follow completely predictable patterns, she reported to Earth Command. Every expansion follows the exact same model: secure resources, establish processing centers, move to the next target. They've never had to adapt, because no one has ever seriously challenged their methods. But humans didn't plan to challenge those methods directly. Instead, they identified 17 critical resource points that the entire Zephyrian war machine depended on. These weren't just supply depots or manufacturing centers, they were the psychological and logistical heart of Zephyrian expansion. Rather than sending fleets to destroy these installations, humans did something far more elegant. They made the Zephyrians destroy them themselves. Using their infiltration of Zephyrian communication networks, human operatives began spreading carefully crafted rumors and false intelligence. They convinced different Zephyrian factions that other parts of their own military were planning betrayals. They created fake evidence of resource hoarding, of secret plots against the hive mind, of individual commanders seeking personal power. Within days, Zephyrian forces that had been advancing in perfect coordination began turning on each other. Supply convoys were attacked by their own escort fleets. Processing centers were sabotaged by the very workers who had built them. Military commanders found themselves fighting defensive battles against other Zephyrian units who had been convinced they were traitors. The galaxy watched in horrified fascination as the most feared military force in known space began to tear itself apart from within. There were no massive battles, no dramatic explosions, no heroic last stands, just the slow, methodical dissolution of an empire as its own paranoia and confusion consumed it. Galactic military observers couldn't understand what they were seeing. Their instruments detected no major human fleet movements, no significant weapons discharges, no traditional signs of warfare at all. Yet somehow the Zephyrian advance had not just stopped, it had reversed. The truth was becoming clear to those who knew how to look for it. Humanity hadn't defeated the Zephyrians through superior firepower or better technology. They had won by understanding their enemy so completely that they could turn the Zephyrians' own strengths into weaknesses. The hive mind that had made them unstoppable became the vector for their own destruction. Their perfect coordination became perfect confusion. Their absolute loyalty became absolute paranoia. As reports continued to flood in from the front lines, or what had been the front lines before they dissolved into chaos, one fact emerged above all others. The humans had spent 3 centuries in exile, not brooding about their banishment, but studying, learning, preparing for the day when the galaxy would need them again. And when that day came, they had been ready with a form of warfare so sophisticated, so psychologically devastating, that their enemies destroyed themselves rather than face defeat at human hands. The galaxy was safe, but as they watched the methodical dismantling of the Zephyrian Empire, many began to wonder if they had simply traded one threat for another, and whether this new threat might be far more dangerous than anything they had faced before. 6 weeks. That's all it took for the mighty Zephyrian Empire to completely collapse. Not through massive space battles or devastating weapons, but through something far more terrifying. They had destroyed themselves from the inside out. Their once unified hive mind had splintered into thousands of competing factions, each absolutely convinced that all the others were traitors who needed to be eliminated. Across former Zephyrian territory, Civil war raged as different groups fought each other with the same ruthless efficiency they had once used against galactic forces. Their fleets turned their weapons on installations they had built. Their colonies rebelled against their own leadership. Their perfect coordination became perfect chaos. The Galactic Council reconvened in emergency session, but this time the atmosphere was completely different from their celebration just weeks earlier. Gone was the joy and relief of peaceful times. Instead, a heavy tension filled the crystal halls as delegates tried to process what they had witnessed. Admiral Park So-young stood at the speaking podium where Ambassador Veltar had once praised their centuries of peace. But where his speech had been full of pride and celebration, her presence carried something much more unsettling, the quiet confidence of someone who had just demonstrated exactly how fragile that peace really was. Her uniform was simple, bearing none of the elaborate decorations that galactic military leaders typically wore. She didn't need symbols of authority when her very presence commanded attention. Every delegate in the chamber understood that they were looking at a representative of the species that had just solved their impossible crisis in a matter of weeks. "Honored delegates," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the vast hall without any need for amplification technology. "You spent 3 centuries perfecting the ethics of warfare. During that same time, we spent our exile perfecting warfare itself." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the usual whispered conversations between delegates had stopped completely. Many of them were seeing a human being for the first time in their lives, and the reality was far different from the primitive, violent creatures they had imagined. "I know what many of you are thinking," Admiral Park continued, scanning the faces of delegates who couldn't quite meet her gaze. "You're wondering if you've simply traded one threat for another. You're asking yourselves whether the cure might be worse than the disease." She paused, letting that thought settle in the minds of her audience. Even their former allies, species that had fought alongside humanity centuries ago, now looked at her with a mixture of respect and fear that hadn't existed before. "Our strength was never our capacity for violence," she explained, her tone remaining calm and measured. "It was our willingness to understand our enemies completely, to think like them, to predict their moves, and when absolutely necessary, to become them." This last phrase sent visible shivers through the assembly. The idea of a species that could psychologically transform itself to match any enemy was more frightening than any weapon they could imagine. It suggested a level of adaptability and ruthlessness that challenged everything they thought they knew about civilized behavior. General Kim Tae-ho stepped up to join Admiral Park at the podium. Where she had been diplomatic and explanatory, his presence was more direct, more commanding. This was clearly someone accustomed to making decisions that affected entire worlds. "The Terran Containment Protocol is hereby dissolved," he announced, his words carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Humanity claims its rightful place in galactic affairs. We will no longer be excluded from the community we have just saved." As he spoke, human ambassadors began filing into the chamber, taking seats in sections that had remained empty for 300 years. Their very presence changed the entire dynamic of the council. These weren't conquered peoples begging for acceptance. These were equals demanding recognition. The delegates watched in stunned silence as the humans settled into their designated areas. Some of the ambassadors were military personnel like Park and Kim, but others were clearly civilians, scientists, diplomats, cultural representatives. They looked remarkably ordinary, which somehow made them even more unsettling. These normal-looking people had just orchestrated the psychological destruction of an entire empire. A new question began forming in the minds of everyone present. In seeking protection from the Zephyrian threat, had they unleashed something far more dangerous? The insects had been brutal and destructive, but they had been predictable. Humans, on the other hand, had proven themselves capable of warfare so sophisticated that their enemies destroyed themselves rather than face direct conflict. "We come before you today with an offer," Admiral Park announced. "Humanity is willing to share our strategic knowledge with all member species. We can teach you how to defend yourselves against threats you haven't even imagined yet." The offer hung in the air like a double-edged sword. The knowledge would undoubtedly be valuable. Humanity had just proven their military expertise beyond any doubt. But accepting that knowledge would also mean acknowledging human superiority in the very area that had led to their exile in the first place. Some delegates began whispering among themselves, weighing the benefits against the risks. Others sat, in thoughtful silence, trying to process the new reality they found themselves in. A few looked openly hostile, clearly unhappy with the sudden shift in galactic power dynamics. General Kim seemed to read the room perfectly. "We understand your concerns," he said. "For 3 centuries you've told yourselves that humans were dangerous primitives who needed to be contained. Today you've learned that we were never the problem. We were simply better at solving problems than you were comfortable with." As the session continued, the true scope of the change became clear. This wasn't just about adding human representatives to the council or lifting old restrictions. This was about acknowledging that the balance of power in the galaxy had fundamentally shifted. Behind the scenes, in the classified corridors of Earth Command back in the Sol system, new protocols were already being established. Humanity would never again allow itself to be excluded from galactic affairs. They had learned from their exile, grown stronger during their isolation, and emerged as the dominant strategic force in known space. The galaxy had peace once more. But it was a different kind of peace than before. It wasn't the peaceful coexistence of equals working together. It was the peace that comes when everyone understands exactly who holds the real power. As the council session ended and delegates began filing out of the chamber, many of them cast nervous glances at the human ambassadors who were now permanent fixtures in their government. The humans had returned to galactic civilization, but they had returned as conquerors who had never needed to fire a shot. The galaxy would never be the same. And somewhere in the back of every delegate's mind was the uncomfortable knowledge that humanity's demonstration of power against the Zephyrians had also been a demonstration for everyone else, a reminder of what happened to those who threatened the peace that humans were now responsible for maintaining.